Hi, everybody. Welcome to the lecture for Module 4. Today, we're going to talk about the Mexican period, which I'm going to talk about very briefly so that we can move on to the gold rush. But basically, um, we are beginning with that kind of end of the mission period. And so for this lecture and for upcoming lectures, I want you to kind of be aware of three broad themes. The first one is migration. Mostly people migrating into California. We're going to talk about why they're coming to California, what is drawing them here, and how many people are coming, when are they coming. The next is economic competition, also resource competition, right? So people are being drawn here for a specific reason, and when that reason or resource becomes scarce or the economy becomes troubled, we're going to see another theme take hold, and that is racism. There's a commonality. It's when there is not enough resources or a bad economy, people tend to look at the last people who showed up as the reasoning for that. But to begin, we're going to start with Mexican independence from Spain. So when we left off last time, we have the mission system in California. In 1821, Mexico declared independence from Spain and fought a war there in order to do so. But basically, California then becomes part of Mexico, the new country of Mexico. And so there is a push to secularize the missions. So we no longer want to have the same feudal system that we had under colonial rule. We don't want the Catholic Church to have all of this land. So we're going to take this land and we are going to turn these missions into not property of the Catholic Church. What was supposed to happen to the property, which did not happen, was originally half of the property was supposed to go to support Native Americans and half was going to go support the priests and the officials. But because there's this shift from colonialism to private enterprise, like under colonialism, you were working the land to serve the crown and to be good Spanish citizens. Like now it's going to be about the private sector, right? We're going to see like the rise of capitalism around this time. So it's all about the private sector and the private enterprise. And so what you wind up with is a system of ranchos. And so again, private land ownership not allowed under Spanish rule, but is encouraged under the new government of Mexico. And so these large land grants, rather than going to support Native Americans, these large pieces of land are given to Mexican elite, or they're sold for a profit in order to make some people very, very wealthy. And as a consequence, you have more people coming in, but then you also have interior populations start to lose more land, right? The ones that were not untouched by the mission system for sure, but not as effective as coastal tribes, they really start to lose more land and suffer incredible violence because of this land grab that is going on in California. So, for example, this is according to one hunting party. They invited the wild Indians and their Christian companions to come and have a feast of pinole and dried meat. The troops, the civilians, and the auxiliaries surrounded them and tied them up. We separated 100 Christians. At every half mile or a mile, we put 6 of them on their knees to say their prayers, making them understand that they were about to die. Each one was shot with 4 arrows. Those who refused to die immediately were killed with spears. We baptized all the Indians, non-Christians, and afterwards they were shot in the back. So there is at this time continued and extensive violence against Native Americans as an attempt to claim land. And these ranchos, right, they require lots of labor. We don't have a formal slave economy in California, but we need people to work on these ranchos, and they use Native Americans for that. So they took advantage of the fact that the tribes had already been fragmented and weren't strong, and that disease continued to devastate these tribes. And what you see is increased migration from places like New Mexico to California in the 1830s. This is what your reading was about, which I'm not going to talk about very much here, except that it's an illustration of while slavery was technically illegal, the status of Native Americans kind of actually maintained what was a de facto slave practice. So what you see in that reading is you see a woman come from New Mexico with a Native American servant who's actually Navajo, brings her to California, and this woman is a de facto slave, and they get into an argument about something, and this Navajo woman is killed. The woman who killed her goes on trial. She has kind of like a shaky claim of self-defense. But even though the fact that she is found guilty, she faces like almost no consequences for this murder. She has to leave for a little while, but she's allowed to come back later on. So the status of Native Americans is very low. Oops, duplicate there. And what we're also seeing at this time from an American point of view is the concept of manifest destiny, which is not new at this moment in history, but it's the idea that Europeans, showed up on the east coast of California, and they are not only have the right to by God, but are it is their imperative to move from coast to coast and take the entire what would become the United States of America. So here's a painting. You see kind of Native Americans being pushed off and fleeing, and settlers coming with an angel kind of over them. So this idea that like it is their divine duty to do this and their divine right. Now, when when Mexico declared independence, Texas was also part of Mexico. And Texas did not really want to be part of Mexico for a couple of reasons. One, they were using slavery, which was not allowed under Mexican law. In addition, most of the people who were there identified as Americans, had come from another part of the U.S. to settle there. They also were Protestant, and the Mexican government wanted them to swear allegiance to Mexico and become Catholic, which they were not that into. And so Texas declared their independence and was a republic, and had tried several times to become an American state unsuccessfully. They were unsuccessful because a lot of people in the U.S. government did not want to have a contentious relationship with Mexico or anger Mexico. But once James Polk becomes president, he is very much all for this idea of manifest destiny. And so he basically facilitated Texas becoming a U.S. state. He also tried to purchase California unsuccessfully from Mexico. And what happens is there is a dispute over the border of Texas, between Texas and Mexico. Mexico says it's one river, the U.S. says it's another, and there are some soldiers in kind of a gray area, and there are some shots fired, and that is the start of the Mexican-American War, which goes on from 1846 to 1848, following that annexation of Texas by the United States. At the end of this war, you get the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which basically gives Mexico a huge portion. You can see on there the Mexican cession, a huge portion of the Southwest United States, what is now the Southwest United States, to the United States. And then there's that last little bit that is purchased a few years later, the Gadsden Purchase, that kind of completes the contiguous continental United States. And then in 1850, California becomes an American U.S. state. It's called the Compromise of 1850 because at the time they wanted to maintain the balance between slave states and free states, so they admitted California as a free state. So again, slavery not allowed in California, but we're going to see they still need people to work, and we're going to see where that comes into play. But what happens right around this time also is the gold rush. So the gold rush started at the beginning of 1849, which is why people who came to find gold were called 49ers, even if they came a couple of years later. And so in 1849, you get 26,000 Europeans, Americans, and Mexican Americans coming to California in order to find gold. Gold had been discovered, and it was advertised as being just incredibly plentiful and all over the place. So 26,000 arrived the first year, 100,000 more arrive in the next year. So massive influx of people into California. This is the point when native populations start to be significantly outnumbered, and become a minority and be marginalized even more. So the image of the 49er is often portrayed as this rugged loner, this man who comes out on his own to strike it rich and find his fortune and working the land. In actuality, though, many were middle-class New Englanders. These are educated men who come from some amount of wealth, have family who has made some type of wealth during the industrialization of the Northeast, and they want to, establish their own fortune. And the reason that it's middle class New Englanders and upper class New Englanders even that are coming is because the cost of California is high, right? It's not easy to get to California at this time. You're not going to hop on an airplane to get here. So a lot of people can't afford to get here. It's people who are on the wealthier side who can even make it out here. And these people have no experience with hard labor. So you can imagine they're about to go through quite a shock to go from kind of middle-class New England society to the hard labor of gold mining. So again, there's two ways to get to California. On the left here is this game called the Oregon Trail, which you might have played in elementary school. I did, where basically you start out with a certain number of supplies and oxen and everything else, and you have to make decisions in order to get to California. And often you do not make it there because you die of disease, or you die in a flood, or you don't make it across the river here. And it was a very treacherous path to make it over by land all the way to California at the time. And so that was the less expensive option. The more expensive option that a lot of people took was to come by ship, which would take, you'd have to go kind of round down by South America, but to come over by boat was certainly the preferred way to get here if you had the means. And so at this time, you have kind of multiple immigration streams coming into California, because not just New Englanders are coming for the gold rush and for the boom of California, but people from Mexico and England and France and Spain and Chile and Peru and China. And you wind up with these cities that are incredibly cosmopolitan and diverse, and also 90% male. It's mostly men who are making this trip. It is not women. Many of them are married, but they are leaving spouses and children behind in order to come to California and get rich. There's also a lot of intermarriage between ethnicities at this point because there are very few women. But, this kind of very romanticized West. I'm going to go out West and strike it rich and kind of live in this rugged frontier. And here's a poster advertising the gold rush, right? There's just gold all over the ground. He was able to pick up a big nugget of gold and without even looking like he got dirty or is breaking a sweat. So gold is advertised as being plentiful and easy to procure. And the men who are coming out, rather than being rugged loners, they're actually forming mining cooperatives that are seen kind of as a way to have this like socialistic brotherhood. So they're all going to kind of live together, eat together, take care of each other, keep each other on the moral high ground, right? They've come without their wives. And so they are going to kind of police each other. And it's seen kind of as a pushback against the industrialization that happened in the Northeast and kind of the pollution and debauchery in cities, and so they're going to form these kind of utopian societies out here. That is the idea. There's initially less racial tension because it's the beginning of the gold rush. There is still some gold, but also it is believed that there's a lot more. But I want to be clear that even though there's less racial tension and that people are kind of like living in these either out mining together or in these cosmopolitan spaces together, people are certainly not seeing people of other races as equal. Your book describes it as a blend of revulsion, attraction, stereotype, and romanticism. Isn't it just kind of magical to just be around all of these simple other people? And Native Americans at this time are also being romanticized. They're viewed as these kind of noble savages and these vanishing Americans. But here you can see a mining company, right? You have white men and other men who have come from China in order to work in mining. Well, in reality, gold was very difficult to procure. It was very hard work. Um, Most, again, had no experience with hard labor, so they didn't quite understand how hard it was going to be. And it was hard financially just to even break even. So by the time you paid to get out there and got your mining equipment, you weren't finding enough gold to even kind of just keep yourself going. And so now non-whites are seen as competition. Right. At this point, we realize there is not plentiful gold. So other groups, anybody who's getting any of it is taking it away from us. And by the mid 1850s, that gold resource is mostly exhausted. There's, pretty much the gold rush happened over a very, very short period of time. And during which, after it becomes clear that there is not all this gold, you see discrimination against Chinese miners in the form of the California Foreign Miners Tax. Which basically taxes foreigners $20 a month, which is quite a bit of money then, in order to mine. This is really interesting because you're talking about a period of time where the U.S. has been a state for less than a decade, or California has been a U.S. state for less than a decade. So you're really getting into who is an American, who is not an American. And who has the right to certain resources and who doesn't have the right to certain resources. And this is going to be a recurrent theme. There is no standardized enforcement to this miners tax, and effectively could be levied by any white man. So any white man could walk up to one of these Chinese mining companies and say, like, you need to pay me your $20 a month Chinese mining tax. What's interesting is because California doesn't have a slave economy and because California needs people to work, the U.S. was formally encouraging immigration from China in 1848, so needing people to come in and work. So that makes it that by 1870, Chinese people from China and Chinese Americans comprise 10% of California's population, a huge percentage of California's population. And then in 1870, there is an economic recession. I won't get into why, but the economy takes a turn for the worse. And like I said earlier, when you have an economy turn bad, it is extraordinarily common to look at the last people who you perceived arrived last or who are most different and blame them for that. And so you get that in the form of things like the Working Man's Party of California, which was a political party which ran on an openly racist platform against Chinese and wanting Chinese to be excluded and kicked out of the country. This is Dennis Keary, who was in charge of the Working Man's Party of California. But what you see is this push coming out of California, this anti-Chinese sentiment really takes hold, and you wind up getting a federal act called the Chinese Exclusion Act. We're going to see sometimes, of course, something that's happening in California really affects the whole country. And so this was passed in 1882, and it is the first law implemented to prohibit a specific ethnic group from immigrating into the United States. This had not happened before. Immigration of other people at this time is unlimited. But then you get this one act directed at Chinese. They can only come in under very specific circumstances, and they have to have very specific skills in order to come in. They also, under this act, could not become naturalized citizens. So you could live here your entire life. There was no opportunity for you to take a test and become a citizen. And this was rationalized because people saw them as incapable of assimilating. The Chinese are simply too different from us. There's no way that they could become proper Americans, which we know, of course, is not true at all. This act stays around all the way until World War II. When we start fighting the Second World War, we are fighting against Japan, and we need China as an ally. And because we need China as an ally, we overturn this act as kind of an act of goodwill towards China. So we are going to end it there with this module. We are going to talk next week about Wong Kim Ark and start to talk about other people migrating into California and the types of economic competition there and discrimination that they face when they do.